The alarm blared like a siren in David Miller's small apartment, jerking him out of restless sleep. He slapped the clock off the bedside table, sending it clattering to the ground. Sitting upright, he rubbed his face, his fingers grazing the coarse stubble on his jaw. This was it, the day everything would change. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and planted his feet on the cold floor, taking a moment to steel himself. The dingy room around him, with its peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of damp plaster, was a stark reminder of where he was coming from. A beat-up desk cluttered with papers and a single folding chair were the only furnishings besides the bed. No more of this, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his unruly hair. Today, everything changes. The name Empyrean Enterprises echoed in his mind like a mantra. It wasn't just a job opportunity. It was the opportunity, a chance to escape this life of mediocrity and claim the success he knew he deserved. Empyrean was the kind of place where dreams were forged into reality, where only the sharpest minds and the most driven souls thrived. And David? David was determined to be one of them. He showered quickly, the lukewarm water doing little to wash away the knot of nerves tightening in his stomach. He shaved carefully, studying his reflection in the mirror. His dark eyes stared back at him, intense and unyielding. "Focus," he whispered to himself, adjusting his tie. The suit he wore was immaculate, a deep navy blue that hugged his lean frame perfectly. He'd spent more than he could afford on it, knowing how much first impressions mattered. The polished black shoes on his feet gleamed under the dim light of the apartment, and his briefcase, though secondhand, looked professional enough. His phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, a text from his mother. "Good luck today, sweetheart. You're going to do amazing. Dad would be so proud." David's chest tightened, but he didn't reply. He didn't have time for sentimentality. His father's memory had driven him this far, but today, it was about him. Grabbing his briefcase, he stepped out of the apartment, locking the door behind him. The hallway was silent, save for the faint hum of the flickering overhead lights. As he descended the creaky stairs, he rehearsed his pitch in his head, every word sharp and precise. The city greeted him with a blast of cold wind. The streets were alive with motion. Cars honked impatiently, vendors hollered about coffee and bagels, and a sea of people surged toward their destinations. David moved through the crowd with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He had mapped out the route to Empyrean's headquarters weeks ago and knew it by heart. The imposing building stood like a monument to ambition in the heart of the business district, its glass walls reflecting the gray, overcast sky. As he approached, his heart began to race. The Empyrean emblem, a sleek silver phoenix, perched atop the skyscraper, glinting faintly in the morning light. To David, it was a beacon, a symbol of the life he was destined for. But as he neared the entrance, something broke his stride. "Spare some change, sir." The voice was low, almost drowned out by the noise of the street, but it caught his attention. David turned his head, his brow furrowing. Sitting near the base of the building was a man who looked like he had been plucked from a Dickens novel. His clothes were ragged and filthy, his face gaunt and streaked with grime. A threadbare cap rested on the ground before him, a meager collection of coins jingling inside. The man's eyes met David's, hollow but strangely piercing. "Please," the beggar said, his voice raspy. "Just a little help." David's irritation flared instantly. He didn't have time for this. He was on the brink of something monumental, and this man's pathetic pleas felt like a distraction. "Why don't you get a job?" David snapped, his tone cold and dismissive. "Sitting here begging isn't going to fix your life." The beggar tilted his head slightly, as if considering David's words. Then, to David's surprise, the man smiled, a faint, enigmatic smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "Good luck today," the beggar said softly, his voice carrying an odd weight. David stiffened, his jaw tightening. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the revolving doors. Behind him, the beggar watched him go, that same strange smile lingering on his face. The moment David stepped inside the Empyrean building, the air seemed to change. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth and power. Polished marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with modern art that likely cost more than David's entire apartment. The hum of activity was intoxicating. Men and women in tailored suits moved with purpose, their conversations clipped and efficient. This was where David belonged. He approached the reception desk, where a young woman with flawless makeup and a practiced smile greeted him. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "David Miller," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here for the 9 a.m. interview with Mr. Gray." Her smile flickered almost imperceptibly, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, Mr. Miller. Please take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." David nodded and moved to the waiting area, his eyes scanning the room. Every detail of the space radiated elegance and precision. The leather chairs were arranged neatly around a glass coffee table stacked with business magazines, and the scent of fresh coffee wafted from a nearby cafe. As he sat down, his confidence surged. This was his moment. He had the skills, the drive, and the vision. Nothing could stop him. And yet, as he glanced toward the glass doors, he couldn't shake the image of the beggar's smile. It was haunting. The enigma of William Gray. High above the bustling streets of the city, in the executive suite of Empyrean Enterprises, William Gray leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the cityscape beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was a man who exuded power effortlessly, his tailored charcoal suit and salt-and-pepper hair complementing his commanding presence. But today, he looked nothing like the CEO of a billion-dollar empire. Gone was the pristine suit, replaced by a tattered jacket and mismatched shoes. His manicured hands bore streaks of grime, and his face was unshaven, the wrinkles around his eyes exaggerated by the dirt caked on his skin. He had spent years perfecting the art of blending into society's ignored corners, becoming invisible to the very people whose characters he sought to understand. A knock at the door broke his contemplation. "Come in," he said, his deep voice steady. His assistant, Eleanor Burns, entered carrying a tablet. Her no-nonsense demeanor and impeccable efficiency had earned her a reputation as Gray's right hand. "The applicants have started arriving," she said, glancing briefly at her watch. "Your little experiment seems to be causing quite a stir, as always." Gray chuckled, the sound low and unhurried. "People show their true colors when they think no one is watching, Eleanor. Empyrean isn't just about talent. It's about character. Skills can be taught. Integrity cannot." She nodded, though she couldn't help but smirk. "And how is the fieldwork today?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Interesting," he said, his voice laced with intrigue. "One of the candidates, David Miller, caught my attention. Ambitious, polished, but," he paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Lacks empathy. Dismissed me like I was nothing." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And yet, you're still intrigued?" Gray nodded. "Arrogance can mask insecurity. Sometimes the ones with the hardest edges have the most to prove. Let's see if he's capable of change." Meanwhile, in the waiting area, David was trying to shake off the nagging unease the beggar's smile had left him with. He glanced at the other applicants, sizing them up. A young woman in a burgundy blazer sat to his right, her fingers tapping nervously on her portfolio. Across from him, a middle-aged man with streaks of gray in his hair adjusted his tie repeatedly, his foot bouncing anxiously. They were all here for the same thing, but David felt a smug sense of superiority. He was sharper, hungrier. The double doors at the end of the lobby opened, and a woman in a sharp black suit stepped out. Her heels clicked against the marble as she addressed the group. "Good morning," she said, her tone brisk. "I'm Eleanor Burns, Mr. Gray's assistant. We'll begin the group interview shortly. Follow me, please." David stood, smoothing his suit, and joined the procession of applicants down a wide corridor. The air grew heavier with anticipation as they were led into a sleek conference room. The room was a testament to Empyrean's wealth and power. A long glass table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs. The walls were lined with abstract paintings, their vibrant colors contrasting with the cool tones of the room. David took a seat near the center, his confidence returning. He was ready for this. The applicants murmured among themselves as they settled in. But the room fell silent when the door opened again. In walked William Gray, no longer the beggar, but the picture of authority. His tailored suit fit perfectly, and his presence commanded immediate respect. David didn't recognize him. "Good morning," Gray began, his voice smooth and firm. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on each applicant just long enough to make them squirm. "Welcome to Empyrean Enterprises. Today isn't just an interview. It's an opportunity to prove you're more than just a resume." David straightened in his chair, his pulse quickening. Gray continued, his expression unreadable. "Empyrean isn't built on intelligence alone. It's built on resilience, integrity, and the ability to lead by example. Today, we'll be testing more than your knowledge. We'll be testing who you are." His words hung in the air like a challenge. Gray motioned to Eleanor, who distributed folders to each applicant. Inside, David found a series of scenarios and problems, each designed to test decision-making, ethics, and leadership. "This task is collaborative," Gray announced. "Work together or fail together. You have 1 hour." The room erupted into controlled chaos as the applicants dove into the task. David quickly took the lead, organizing the group and delegating roles. He was in his element, his sharp mind slicing through the problems with precision. But as the clock ticked down, Gray watched from the corner, his sharp eyes missing nothing. David was brilliant, no doubt, but his domineering approach left little room for others to shine. As the hour ended, Gray called time. The applicants presented their solutions, and David delivered the final pitch with confidence, his voice steady and persuasive. Gray listened intently, nodding occasionally. But when David finished, he leaned forward, his piercing gaze meeting David's. "Impressive," Gray said. "But tell me, Mr. Miller, what's more important? Solving the problem or empowering the team?" David hesitated, caught off guard. "The result is what matters most," he said carefully. Gray's lips twitched into a faint smile. "An interesting perspective." As the session concluded, Gray stood. "Before we proceed, I want to share something with you all." He stepped toward the head of the table, his expression serious. "This morning, I encountered a man outside our building, a beggar. Some of you may have seen him. He wasn't just any beggar. He was me." A collective gasp rippled through the room. David's stomach dropped. His mind raced as the memory of the man outside the building resurfaced with startling clarity. Gray's eyes scanned the room, resting on David for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "What I learned about each of you in those few moments was far more revealing than anything you've said or done here today." The room fell silent, the weight of Gray's words pressing down on them all. David's palms began to sweat. For the first time, his confidence faltered. The silence in the room was suffocating. David's pulse pounded in his ears as William Gray's words hung in the air. "The way you treat people when you think no one is watching speaks volumes about your character," Gray continued, his tone steady but laced with gravity. His sharp gaze swept the room again, searching for reactions. David swallowed hard, his earlier confidence crumbling. He could feel his face flush as the memory of his interaction with the beggar replayed in vivid detail. His dismissive words, the judgmental glare, the coldness in his tone, it all came rushing back. Gray paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Empyrean is more than a company," he said, his voice carrying an almost sermon-like quality. "It's a vision, a commitment to values that extend beyond profit margins. We don't just hire talent. We hire leaders. And true leadership isn't about how you treat those above you, but how you treat those you perceive as beneath you." The room remained frozen, every applicant too afraid to speak. David felt the weight of the speech pressing down on him. Did he know? The possibility churned in his stomach. Gray's gaze landed on him again, piercing and deliberate. David's throat tightened. He resisted the urge to fidget, sitting as still as a stay. Gray stopped at the head of the table, placing his hands flat on its surface. "Now," he said, his tone shifting to something softer but no less intense, "I won't name names. I won't single anyone out, but I will give each of you a chance to reflect." He straightened, his posture commanding yet calm. "I want each of you to take 5 minutes. Think about the choices you made today, how you approached the tasks, how you interacted with one another, and how you reacted to the unexpected. And most importantly," he said, his eyes flicking toward David once more, Consider whether you lived up to the ideals of integrity and empathy that we value here. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Gray stepped out, leaving the applicants to wrestle with their thoughts. David's mind raced. He replayed the day's events, analyzing every word, every decision, and every interaction. His encounter with the beggar loomed large, dominating his thoughts. He clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. How was I supposed to know? He thought bitterly. He looked like just another homeless guy on the street. But even as he tried to justify his actions, a gnawing sense of guilt crept in. The truth was, deep down, he had always looked down on people like that. People who hadn't tried hard enough. The memory of the beggar's calm, knowing smile now felt like a slap in the face. David glanced at the other applicants. Most looked equally uncomfortable, their expressions clouded with doubt and anxiety. A few whispered to one another, their voices barely audible. "Did you see the beggar?" The woman in the burgundy blazer murmured to the man beside her. "Yeah," he replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't think much of it at the time. Just gave him a couple of coins and moved on." David's stomach churned. He had done nothing, worse than nothing. He had dismissed the man entirely, leaving a trail of cutting words in his wake. The door opened, and Gray re-entered the room. His presence was as commanding as ever, but his expression was unreadable. "Time's up," he said, his voice breaking the tension. "Now, let's continue." The applicants straightened in their chairs, their nervous energy palpable. Gray stood at the end of the table, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. "Before we move forward, I have one final question for each of you. Answer honestly, and consider your words carefully." He looked directly at David first, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice steady, "if given the opportunity to lead at Empyrean, what would you say is your greatest strength? And what is your greatest weakness?" David felt his mouth go dry. He had rehearsed answers to countless interview questions, but this one, coming in the wake of Gray's earlier reveal, felt like walking a tightrope. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. Do I lie and say what he wants to hear? Or do I tell the truth? "My greatest strength," David began, his voice steady but quieter than before, "is my ability to analyze problems and find efficient solutions. I'm driven, focused, and I don't let obstacles stop me." He hesitated, the weight of his next words pressing down on him. "My greatest weakness," he continued, his voice faltering slightly, "is that sometimes I focus too much on the end goal and not enough on the people around me. I realize now that success isn't just about results. It's about how you get there and who you lift up along the way." The room was silent. David forced himself to meet Gray's eyes, unsure of what he'd find there. To his surprise, the CEO's expression softened slightly. There was no triumph or condescension, just a hint of approval. Gray nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Miller." The rest of the applicants answered in turn, some faltering, others finding their footing. But David felt a shift within himself. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about how to prove himself or outshine others. He was thinking about the kind of person he wanted to be. When the session finally ended, Gray stood and addressed the group. "Thank you all for your time today. You'll hear from us soon." The applicants filed out, their expressions a mix of relief and uncertainty. David lingered near the door, his heart pounding. He turned back toward Gray, who was gathering his notes at the table. "Mr. Gray," David said, his voice firm but respectful. Gray looked up, his sharp eyes meeting David's. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," David said, his throat tightening, "for how I treated you earlier. I didn't know, but that's not an excuse. I was wrong, and I'll do better." Gray studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step to growth, Mr. Miller. The question is, will you act on it?" David nodded, determination hardening in his eyes. "Yes, sir, I will." Gray's lips quirked into the faintest of smiles. "Good. We'll be watching." The days after the interview were agonizing for David. Each passing moment felt like an eternity as he waited for a call or email from Empyrean Enterprises. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart leaped, only to plummet when it wasn't the message he had been hoping for. But amidst the uncertainty, David found himself reflecting more deeply than ever before. He replayed Gray's words in his mind, dissecting every nuance of the day. For the first time, he considered the possibility that success wasn't just about ambition or achievement. It was about the impact he made on others. He began to notice things he had overlooked before. The overworked barista at the coffee shop who still managed to smile. The janitor in his apartment building who greeted him warmly every morning. David started small, offering genuine thanks, giving a helping hand when he could, and most importantly, listening. A week later, David's phone rang while he was drafting an email for another job application. His stomach dropped when he saw the number. "Hello?" he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Miller, this is Eleanor Burns from Empyrean Enterprises." David's heart raced. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for calling. We'd like to invite you back for a second interview," Eleanor said, her tone professional but warm. "Mr. Gray believes there's more to discuss." David exhaled, relief washing over him. "Thank you. I won't let you down." When David arrived at Empyrean's headquarters again, he felt a strange mixture of confidence and humility. This time, as he approached the building, he noticed another man sitting near the entrance, a real beggar, huddled in a thin jacket against the cold. David hesitated for only a moment before walking over. "Hey," he said softly, crouching down. "You hungry?" The man looked up, his eyes weary but hopeful. "Yeah, I am." David reached into his wallet and handed the man a $20 bill. "Get yourself something warm? Okay." The man nodded, his gratitude evident. "Thank you." David smiled. "Take care of yourself." This time, when he walked into Empyrean, he felt lighter. Gray greeted him in his office, a sprawling space filled with bookshelves and sleek furniture. The windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but David's focus was on the man behind the desk. "David," Gray said, gesturing for him to sit. "Welcome back." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity." Gray leaned forward, his piercing gaze fixed on David. "Tell me, what have you learned since our last meeting?" David took a deep breath. "I've learned that success isn't just about what I can achieve, but about who I become in the process. I realized I wasn't looking at the whole picture before. I was so focused on proving myself that I forgot the value of empathy and respect for others." Gray studied him for a moment, then nodded. "And what will you do differently if you're given the chance to lead here at Empyreans?" "I'll lead by example," David said firmly. "I'll listen, support, and empower the people around me. And I'll remember that every person, no matter their position or circumstance, deserves to be treated with dignity." Gray's expression softened, and for the first time, David saw genuine approval in his eyes. 2 days later, David received the call he had been waiting for. He was offered a position at Empyrean Enterprises, not the leadership role he had initially aimed for, but a managerial position with room to grow. It was a humbling start, but David embraced it wholeheartedly. He threw himself into his work, applying the lessons he had learned to every task and interaction. He took the time to know his team, offering guidance and encouragement. Gray watched from afar, pleased with David's progress. The young man's transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Months passed, and David began to thrive. His team respected him, not because of his title, but because of the integrity he demonstrated daily. One evening, as David was leaving the office, he spotted Gray in the lobby. "Mr. Gray," David called, jogging over. Gray turned, a faint smile on his face. "David, how's the team?" "They're incredible," David said earnestly. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Gray nodded. "You earned it." David hesitated, then said, "Can I ask you something? Why did you give me a second chance after how I acted?" Gray's smile widened slightly. "Because I saw potential. You had the courage to admit your mistakes and the drive to improve. That's what leadership is about, growth, not perfection." David nodded, the weight of Gray's words settling over him. Years later, David stood in Gray's office, now as one of Empyrean's senior executives. The two men shared a bond forged through trust and respect. "I'm retiring soon," Gray said, his tone calm but resolute. David's eyes widened. "Retiring? But the company is in good hands," Gray interrupted, his gaze steady. "Your hands if you're ready." David felt a lump in his throat. I don't know if I'll ever be ready to fill your shoes. Gray chuckled. Leadership isn't about filling someone else's shoes. It's about carving your own path. You've proven you can do that. David nodded, determination shining in his eyes. I'll do my best. I know you will, Gray said, extending his hand. David shook it, feeling the weight of the responsibility, but also the pride of earning it. David Miller became the CEO of Empyrean Enterprises, leading the company into a new era of success and innovation. He never forgot the lessons he learned from William Gray, and he ensured that empathy and integrity remained at the core of the company's values. And every morning, as he walked into the building, he made it a point to acknowledge every person he passed, from the janitor to the executives, because he knew that true success wasn't just about rising to the top. It was about lifting others along the way. If you find this story interesting, please subscribe to my channel for more.